request you to enlighten us on the topic how to as masters in public policy and alternate career opportunities in law and policy. Sir.
Thank you for that really generous welcome, Rajesh. Also, may I just request all of you, please do not address me as sir. Like you people say sir, I immediately think of my father and not myself. Just call me Ameen. I'm happy to be addressed with my first name. So I thought that I think we have like approximately like an hour to go with this. So I will essentially split my conversation between what law school was predominantly for me like with respect to legal research and what kind of things I did in law school. And immediately after that, like once I graduated, I started working with J Sagar, which was again mostly like litigation work. So while there was legal research, it was of a particular kind, which was considerably different from the kind of work that I'm doing right now. uh, in my second bit, I will talk a bit about my first couple of years with Vidhi when I started working in the policy space and how that went, how were my interactions with some senior bureaucrats. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sure.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Uh, Great. Thank you. And how that went with like how my interactions were, how the like when I was in law school, basically policy wasn't really an option, and like in the span of last 5 to 7 years, it seems to become a much more prominent space, especially even for law graduates to consider. And from there, I'll go into like more about my masters and what I've been doing since coming back. And perhaps we can wrap it up with like, so I think I will be done in like around 30 to 35 minutes or like 40 minutes maximum. And from there, we can probably have a bit more interaction. If you people have some questions particularly, then I'll be happy to answer those. So I went to NUJS in 2007, and I will be candid with you. Like when I went to law school first, my school education was not great in teaching us research methods. Like I don't think school education in India in any extent caters to the idea of you becoming good researchers. So when I first entered law school, and I still remember like this was probably my second or my third week, and we had like the first round of our internal moot court selections. We had a problem which was quite interesting. It pertained to some aspects of criminal law and IPC, things which obviously like first year students are rarely exposed to, and particularly like I hadn't even done like my first year. I was just like 2 weeks old into the institution. So that was perhaps a good eye-opening experience for me in understanding the true lacking that I had from a researcher's perspective, that I was quite ill prepared. And when I eventually did go for my oral submissions, I felt quite harrowed through that experience. But I will definitely say that through that and through subsequent rounds of mooting and otherwise like working on projects and everything, I think legal research was certainly something that I was quite good at, and like I improved over the years, and I was interested in it as much as my like I wasn't very fond of all subjects that we were being taught, but the few subjects that were of interest to me, like jurisprudence or constitutional law, things like that, those were areas where I would actually work hard on my project. And I think to a certain extent we all have some similar kind of stories to like I in my presumption is that there would be some few exceptional students who would give 100% to every single project paper that they're writing or every single report they're preparing in law school. And at some level we all seem to sort of drop the ball with respect to our research skills and everything. But again, law school research is primarily focused in a very academic research orientation. It is more about you understanding the reading of statutes. It's much more about you getting comfortable with different kinds of case laws and different sources to research these avenues, rather than thinking extensively about how you want to develop your argument, building skills in a particular field. So if I'm talking about, say, the right to privacy, field specifically for legal scholars,
Right.
uh, again, I think like law students would probably be much more dominant on understanding the historical jurisprudence, how through the all that historical jurisprudence and Puttu Swami, and then trying to critique it and build arguments on how this can potentially have real life implications. And I mean, that is not to the discredit of law students. It's also the fact that law school, to a certain extent, teaches you legal research in a particular fashion. You are taught much more about like the value of precedents and reinforcing that idea through your own research rather than innovating thought processes and thinking about more innovative arguments using existing jurisprudence. Those are, in my experience, like the kind of limitations that are there in legal research that we are taught in law schools. So I think my big break from that kind of limitation was when I first started working with J Sagar Associates, which is where, like you speak to any practicing lawyer, she will definitely confirm this idea that what you teach, what you're taught in law school, while in theory it is sound and also helps, but in practice things take a considerably different turn. You need to innovate arguments. You need to see things which are not conventional or evergreening of older principles. Of course, there are times when you have to uphold principles, but there are times when you have to conflict them. And the only way you can conflict them is like basically think new and see how you can mold the existing precedent or existing jurisprudence to your own advantage or to the proposition that you are defending. And litigation is perhaps one of the more interesting and involving methods of doing that, to gain that kind of versatility where you have to dismantle existing arguments and sort of recreate them into different ideas, argue innovatively, think on your feet, be quick in your rebuttal, and all those things. But at the heart of it, legal research is fundamentally doctrinal. I'm pretty sure most of you would have heard this
Right, sir.
terminology, doctrinal research. But to be honest, I don't think we understand truly what doctrinal research is till you compare it to other forms of research like empirical research or experiential research and things like that. So, doctrinal research typically talks about theories and case law or understanding historic contexts and things like that, but in a much more theoretical sense. Whereas, and it's not about like quantifying information or qualitatively appreciating things or interviewing or undertaking like some qualitative methods to better understand. You are essentially looking at an architect, like you're looking at a case law to get a sense of what the situation was, and that is your be all end all. And the way law is taught and the way law is practiced mostly, that is the core essence of legal practice, that you rarely go beyond what your brief says, what the statute says, what case law says. And even when you have to innovate ideas, you can only innovate them in a doctrinal sense rather than an empirical sense. I think this difference will become a bit more clear as I delve into what empirical research is more about and why it is significantly different. So in JSA, again, like I said, my work was quite different, and the kind of research that I was doing was significantly different from what I had done in law school. In law school, I had written papers, I had gone to moot courts, but while they gave me like a theoretical understanding of the law, in court practice it's very different. Like, so one key difference, for instance, between litigation and academic writing would be that even the most granular piece of academic writing would probably not be like, would not try to strip down a proposition to its bare bones as much as you have to in legal in a litigation scenario. Because in litigation scenario things can literally turn on a single adjective or a preposition in a sentence. And typically when you're doing academic writing, you tend to see a larger picture, a bigger picture to construct your argument. Whereas in litigation, it's all about breaking things down to find that one point where you can use it to your advantage. If the whole case law is against you, you will try to find those bits of the obiter which you can somehow use for your benefit and things like that. So the granularity that you gain in legal research is very important. And I think for me, that came when I was doing litigation work for 3 years with J Sagar. Policy work is, again, like a whole different ball game. So just to give you like a bit of context, how I even started thinking about this in the first place was, when I first started working at J Sagar, I was mostly into like transactional and commercial litigation work for a year. And I was doing that for almost a year. After which I decided to ask my partner to transfer me to the regulatory policy team, which not only does advisory work, but also had a lot of litigation work in tribunals like APTL and NCLAT and things like that, but also in the Supreme Court and the Delhi High Court and different district courts, etc. So that is where I had the first taste of what policy making is like, because when you're advising, even though you're doing it for a client, you are talking about regulations, they're drafting, and you do send in advisory notes which talk about how can these regulations be improved, or what kind of push you should insist with the government or the policymakers, or how you should engage with them to improve these regulatory processes for yourself and for the ecosystem to make it more efficient. And the litigation side of it is again also much more technical. So I worked for 2 years with the electricity distribution companies in Delhi, the BSCS companies and the Tata company. So a lot of my work was surrounding the Electricity Act and a lot of technical work, which included me to understand how the system works, how that ecosystem works, what are distribution companies, what are generation companies, what are transfer companies, and all those terminologies and everything, which again is something no law school would teach you. So even if they did have a course on, say, Electricity Act, they would give you the bare bone understanding of what the legislation say. So they will tell you that this act is basically divided into a regulatory framework, both at the central and the state level. It then talks about some penalties, it talks about an appellate procedure, and some miscellaneous provisions. And essentially, they will ask you to read case laws on like things like that and how these provisions have come. And maybe like to sum it all up, they'll give you like some overview of how this act is currently operating. That is largely it. But it is very different when you have to go day in and out and actually argue cases which utilize that legislation, because that is exactly what I was saying, that while precedent and everything holds value, in actual litigation, it's not just about finding case law. Finding case law is part of the process where you are constructing a larger argument. So you have to innovate, you have to think out of the box and think of things which previously possibly haven't even been deliberated or discussed anywhere in any paper or any previous judgment. And that is the whole idea of an evolving jurisprudence or a dynamic jurisprudence. When you say the Constitution is a living document, it is essentially for these reasons, that what you read about constitutional law in the 60s or the 70s cannot continue to be in effect in absolute sense even today in the 21st century, or like 2 decades down into the 21st century. So litigation was that. And through my work in regulatory policy, I basically started getting a greater sense of how policy processes work, even though my focus was, again, like I said, on public private partnerships, particularly in the electric distribution industry, and like with a focus on Delhi and the NCR regions. It gave me a flavor of what this process is like. And I think towards my third year's end, like in my last few months, I had a few conversations with people who had started working in like different think tanks, etc. Not all of them in India. And through those conversations and through my experience, I felt that probably what I wanted to do more was actually be somehow involved in the policy making process or that kind of discourse. So I wanted to venture more into outside of litigation and like legal advisory into more of a policy research position. And so I started thinking about places. Initially I was considering maybe I should just apply for a master's in law, do some like a master's in law with a focus on regulatory policy or something like that. But through like a couple of months of deliberation, I came around with the option of Vidhi, and Vidhi was coincidentally also looking for some people at that point of time to set up its own team on judicial reforms. And my background sort of aligned very well with the kind of profile they were looking for. They wanted someone who was like a young lawyer who had some practice experience and things like that, and had like decent credentials in his or her background. And accordingly I applied to them, and they set up the judicial reforms team. Now coming to Vidhi was again like a big transition for me, not just with respect to like my work routine changed significantly as a researcher from like a litigator, but at the same time like the kind of work that was expected, the kind of research particularly that was expected, was very different. I remember like in my first few months I really struggled because, like I said, for 3 years I had been working in litigation, and my orientation was very much focused to like a proposition based research, where like I have a question, I have a legal proposition, and I'm trying to defend it or contest it. Whereas yet again I had to go into a larger, bigger picture framework. I had to go back to academic writing. And the difference this time in my academic orientation was that I could not just limit myself to doctrinal research. This is something that I realized when I had my first meeting with a joint secretary in the Department of Justice of the government of India. And in one of those conversations, so this was a gentleman who was not from a legal background. He had a law degree, but he had never really practiced. And for most of his career, he had not worked in the law ministry or with lawyers, etc. So when we were trying to explain certain things about case law pendency, etc., so on and so forth, those things were very obvious and intuitive to us, given our own background in law. And as practitioners, like we had litigated, and we were now also like dedicated legal researchers, even in the policy space. But I realized for someone like him who's not from that kind of a background, they have much more qualitative questions which go beyond just the legality of something that you are talking about. So if I'm proposing like that one of the earliest things that I worked on was this report on the Supreme Court pendency, which was later also cited by the Supreme Court in one of its judgments as research that they wanted to rely on, this PIL that they were addressing at that point of time. So an issue that was being debated in that PIL was the setting up of regional benches, as well as segregating the Supreme Court's work into a constitutional court versus a regular appeals court. So that was the larger proposition, and coincidentally our paper had adequately also delved into these questions. And I was having the same conversation with this gentleman at the Department of Justice, and he was basically asking me things like, which went beyond like, okay, what is happening in other countries? Of course those are things which they do ask. So what is the UK doing, what is Ireland doing, what is America doing, do they have separate constitutional courts? But then they would also ask, how do we bring this kind of a reform in a fraternity which for decades has a very set mentality? How do you bring about that behavioral change? Now this is something that doctrinal legal research cannot answer. I am not a social scientist, I am not a behavioral scientist, I have not studied human behaviors or any kind of like ethnography efforts or things like that. I have not interacted with lawyers. What I can speak of is my own experience as a lawyer and what I felt in those 3 years, and whether I personally would support such a motion or not. I hadn't done any kind of actual field work to either contest or support that motion that lawyers, largely because they are set in a particular framework, would either oppose it or support it. I could give an instinctive answer, which is unfortunately what most lawyers, judges, or legal academics also tend to do, because our mindsets are tuned to a certain kind of research, which does not involve a lot of field work or empirical analysis. This
Right.
was like a repetitive feature over the next 2 years in like numerous conversations that I had. Of course, in time, I understood a few more things about certain questions. Like certain questions were very typical, so you would be better prepared for them in time, and you would understand what you can say as a stalling answer. But there was always this lingering sense that I am not adequately equipped to be a policy researcher. And one of the big deficiencies that I saw was my lack of understanding of empirical research methods, and in general how to use research evidence in policy making, which was something that I was instinctively driven towards, but I did not know how to accomplish it. So that was basically the mindset I had in my second year. And basically, when I started looking towards a master's program, I started looking at programs which were, one, not a master's in law, because I had this feeling that an LLM would essentially, even if I am going for a higher education program, it will sort of reinforce certain things that I've already studied in law school, be it constitutional law, criminal law, common law jurisprudence, etc., perhaps for a different jurisdiction. But at some level, it would be a redundant process, especially given the fact that I don't intend to practice law. Like my professional objective and my professional ambitions are different. So I cannot go back to law school, even if it is for a master's program instead of a graduation, like an undergrad program. So in that context, I started looking initially at like general MPP programs. And while I was applying for them, I got accepted at a couple of universities, including NUS, which has this very interesting 2-year program. The only 2-year program that I applied to, but it's a dual degree program, because what they do is, in your first year you study at NUS, and if you have like, if you maintain a certain grade point average and a certain caliber in your academic performance, then they have tie-ups with like 13 or 15 top public policy institutions across the globe. And in your second year, you can basically switch with you can go on an exchange program. So at the end of those 2 years, you will have an MPP degree from NUS as well as this other university. So it was quite interesting, which is why like it sort of attracted me, despite like I was quite keen on going to a 1-year program rather than a 2-year program. But this was like a novel format, so I applied to it. I also did get through it. But as I was sort of closing out this paperwork, I found this program on UCL, which was not an MPP. It was actually a Master in Sciences. And the program was called Systematic Reviews for Social Policy and Practice. I believe since then they've actually retermed it as maybe like uh, Social Policy and Research or something like that. But like their focus was much more on giving an overview of empirical research methods, giving an overview of systematic reviews, which is again another form of empirical research beyond your conventional quantitative and qualitative methods, and also talk about how evidence can be used, can be developed for policy processes, and how do you ensure that a policymaker engages with that evidence, whether it rejected or something. Those are different situations. But at the very least, how do you sort of incentivize policymakers, or you convince them to go for a more evidence-based approach rather than just doing what their gut feeling tells them, or being purely driven by political motives or like political optics? So it seemed like a very interesting program, and with a great degree of alignment with my own understanding of what I wanted and how I was seeing my own work in the coming years as a policy researcher. So I basically applied for this program, was fortunate enough to get through it, and spent a wonderful year in London where I was, for the first time in my life, introduced to qualitative methods like ethnography, focus groups, interviews, surveys, things that I'm pretty sure even as law school students, if you do reading, if you do like an interdisciplinary reading, you will come across these terms. And I had come across these terms in my 2 years at Vidhi as well. But for the first time, I was actually being educated and trained in that skill set, which was the distinction, which was great. Like, instead of trying to self teach myself these things, I had a master's dissertation. And after a year, basically, like, I was quite vindicated with my choice of the program. And much more importantly, I think, like, the feeling that I had prior to going to London about like using evidence, or how evidence should be informing policy processes and decision making processes, I felt much more at ease, and I felt that I had a better understanding of how to sort of work in the space to develop that, even in a country like India, where, forget like evidence based policy, but like the use of policy researchers is quite a new and novel concept. I mean, like, when I was in law school, the only way you actually got to be a part of the policy making process was either you wrote the civil services and became a bureaucrat, or you had the wealth and the means and resources at your disposal to join a political party and become a politician, which are again very different avenues. But policy research and being a policy professional is a much recent question, much recent uh, profession within India. And what I've seen is that in the span of like 5 to 7 years, it's actually exploded. There's a lot of traction and attraction for it. Again, not just within law students, but across the board. It's like, to give a loose analogy, it's like what software engineering and software industry was in the 90s. I don't know if any of you is a 90s kid, but that is usually like the analogy that typically comes to my mind, because growing up, that was the big thing. Everybody wanted to be a software engineer or find some kind of an in, whether through an MBA or like through an engineering degree. And even lawyers were trying to do that. And now it feels that policy making and like policy research, policy advocacy, and the whole umbrella of different kinds of roles that you can play is becoming like a big thing for a large intersection of different disciplines of graduates. So that was my experience in London. And I'll since coming back from London, I have again started working at Vidhi. I have been sort of I've been a senior resident with the Jaldi mission, and more importantly, I have a certain versatility. So my more recent work over the last year or so has been a lot on AI ethics and AI governance, which again, like, if somebody was telling me 10 years back that that is what you will be doing, a kid who never did, like, who hated maths as a child, and who never took the science stream and anything, it's quite remarkable. But that, I feel in hindsight, that is the true sense of a researcher. A researcher has certain skill sets which truly make her versatile and allow you the kind of competence that you need. I'm not saying that domain expertise is nothing. Of course, there is domain expertise, but when you have a critical mindset, you have the luxury or the advantage of actually being more versatile with your research focus. I started working in the policy space purely on the Indian justice system, on issues which have been debated not just by me and my colleagues, but like what were being debated for almost 60 to 70 years, right from India's independence, when we set up our own independent judiciary, like things like
Right.
pendency, backlog. But we were trying to bring new facets to that debate, because what we found was that that debate seems to have stagnated always about like increased number of judges, add more funds, and nobody's actually delving deep. And that depth is lacking because people within the conventional legal research business are not really trained to dig that kind of have that kind of a depth in their understanding. They're not empirical researchers. They have a limitation to their research, which is why you need to collaborate, which is why either you need to go and sort of gain that kind of interdisciplinary knowledge, or you need to collaborate with other professions. And it is not good enough for lawyers or judges to say that the judiciary is their dominion and outsiders or social scientists or economists cannot contribute to it. There's a lot that, like, at the day's end, the judiciary is as much a public institution as any other wing of the government, and it interacts with all kinds of spaces. So it cannot just be dealt in terms of what is legal and constitutional. You cannot have that kind of a dichotomy overruling every other facet to it. And yeah, so like now when I talk about AI ethics and governance, that's also a very interesting space of how like eCoach project is talking about. And now during the pandemic, we've obviously seen a lot of surge in this conversation of what technology can do, and people are talking about AI and things like that. But there's again a very novice like and a very rookie like understanding of what these terminologies are, what these technologies are, what they do. You need people, you need a broader stakeholder engagement, a wider stakeholder engagement, a process which is much more participatory. And that's pretty much what I am sort of working towards. So yeah, that's the end of my monologue, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for this insightful and detailed explanation.
Thank you.
One question that I am saying is that how to choose college and requirement. What are the requirement to be a master's in abroad?
So to be honest, it's like it varies. There's the like generally people would say that if you go to some of the top colleges in the UK, say like a Cambridge or Oxford, or like even UCL, your academic scores matter a lot. But I went to UCL, and to be honest, my academic credentials were not great from my bachelor's program. Like I had slightly above average, grade point average. I had like a lot of papers and work ex and things like that, which sort of worked in my favor. But that's the second thing. So it also depends considerably on what program you're choosing. So if most of you end up going into like an LLM program, I don't think I can dispense the idea that grades matter. Grades do matter. If people are considering policy alternatives or something as unconventional as what I did, those are avenues where I feel that even the universities which are offering those programs, they're offering them for specific kinds of professionals. So for them, I think your work ex and your work background matters a lot more than what you've done in your years at law school. What I do strongly recommend, and this is like, of course, my personal position, but I have a strong bias for this. Uh, Work for some time before you actually apply for your masters. Don't do that, because I can tell you from my experience, had I applied right after law school, I would have done an LLM and my life would have been on a very different trajectory. A lot of things that I
Right.
experienced in JSA have subsequently been, guiding lights and beacons for me in my future progress. And I think it is quite insightful. A real working career shows you things about your own personality and yourself as a professional, which then in turn allows you a better insight of what you want to do. Because let's be honest, nobody's going to do like 2 or 3 master's programs. Very rarely will people do that. So you need to be careful and prudent and judicious in making that decision.
Sir, another question is what does good policy look like?
What does good policy look like?
Yes, sir.
Can you be more specific? That's a very,
Uh, there's a
like,
question in
in
the
what
chat
sense, what
box.
are, how, let me pose a counter question. What are you defining as good in that?
Yes, can you unmute yourself and direct question to the sirs?
Okay, I will answer that as honestly as I can. I don't know what to say about like what a good policy is. What I can say is that it is favorable if you take as much information as you can before you take a decision. That is common sense and logic. But I can assure you that there is no country or no policy process in the world which is apolitical or which is not driven by political values and beliefs. One of the things that they taught us when we were studying like basic policy theory, which is something similar to like jurisprudence, if you think about it, and this is a thought that used to come to me even when I was studying it, how many of you have actually studied jurisprudence here, like rough, like, anyway, if I don't think we can do like a show of hand here, but students who study jurisprudence, I'm assuming you're aware of the realist school, which talks about how law is not so much what the letter of the law says, but much more about what a judge reads and interprets that law to be. And the way she will interpret the law is dependent on a lot of political biases, their own inherent values and beliefs, and their own implications. And there's the Scandinavian realist school, which also talks about something like, say, if a judge who sits in a matrimonial court had a dispute with her partner in the morning, and then she has to sit on a divorce petition later in the court, that fight in the morning is going to impact her ruling and how she sees the law for that day. So interpretation of the law is extremely subjective, and that is the main argument of the realist school. This is all the more true when you talk about a policy making process. So how the current government of India or certain people within the government of India will view the right to privacy or data protection will obviously be governed by their own individual beliefs, their party beliefs, their political mindsets, and all those elements will come into play. And no amount of research evidence can completely overrule that. So one thing I guess, the elimination of political bias, political values and beliefs, it is to mitigate it or to balance it out or to sort of recast them in a more informed position. You cannot have any apolitical policy processes. So when you say something that is leak proof, it cannot be. There is going to be no policy which is one unanimously accepted, because even say if you and I fundamentally agree that there should be a right to privacy, there will be more nuance into it, where you and I will have differences. Why we feel that? What extent of policy, like privacy, is okay? Where, what kind of exceptions can be carved out of it? Those are nuances which will be there and which are evolving over a period of time. And there is never unanimity. Even people who never unanimous. Unanimous is a very strong term which does not ever exist when you talk about law and policy. Whether it's a legislation that you're drafting or a policy that you're making, things will always have a certain amount of people who agree with it, certain amount of people who partially agree with it, certain amount of people who completely oppose it, and certain amount of people who don't care. And within those, each of those brackets, there will be nitty-gritties and differences. So leak proof policy is nothing. Like, there is no leak proof policy, and honestly you shouldn't be in the space, because society is dynamic and your governance needs to be equally dynamic. There's a reason why judges and jurisprudence so much effort on the constitution being a living document. If what they wrote in the 1940s was great and all encompassing, then why would we need a living document? And that same logic applies as much to policy making as it does to legal drafting or legislation drafting.
Sir, there is a question. 1 minute, sir. I'm sorry. Is it better to do a MPP from India or abroad? How can one gain work experience in the public policy sphere where one does not have a law or policy background?
So on the first question, to be honest, like around the time when I was applying for my MPP, I think there were only two schools which had recently started their public policy programs, and there were no other public policy. So NLS had started a dedicated public policy program, and I think TIS was the other one. Now I think Jindal University also has one. But again, so I think right now, uh, what I've heard is some really positive feedback from universities like Azim Premji and NLS internal public policy programs. So I wouldn't completely write them off. I also do not have personal experience to comment on that. I can say that one thing that sort of uh, does put somewhat more advantage in going abroad is that this discipline again is unfortunately quite a Western notion, where they talk about policy research and things like that. These ideas are predominantly westernized, which is not to say that we cannot develop them in India, but I think we are at a stage where they are like in teaching they're not adequately developed, or perhaps they are getting there, and hopefully in the coming years they will be. I would again suggest that the only benefit of going outside, which I had, was that I got to interact with a lot of diverse mindsets, and people, like in my entire cohort, I was the only lawyer. No one else was a law student. So I hope that also answers your other question. If you don't have a law and policy background, you can very much be a part. I was predominantly working with people who were like social scientists, educational experts. A lot of them were teachers and like professors and things like that. So I went into a space which was not dominated by lawyers, and I found my peers to be quite competent and quite good with their understanding. So I don't think that's a handicap. I think is discipline, and it requires people from different backgrounds to actually come into it. It shouldn't just be lawyers who monopolize this domain. Otherwise, it will just become like what we do with legal reform.
Sir, if you permit, can we take the last question?
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah. So the last question is, what are the major trends in this field, sir? Outlook or major trends in this field?
You'll have to be a bit more precise. Trends regarding what?
Trends in this field. The question is, sir, what is the outlook or what are major
No,
trend in
so
this field?
like, can whoever's asking this question, can you be a bit more specific? Are you like trends regarding what
Uh,
are you talking about?
I request or in public policy. Yes,
No,
yes,
no,
we are
you
talking about
no,
public.
no. You need to. So what I'm asking is, please, major trend regarding what? Major trend regarding like job opportunities. Major trend regarding programs that you can go for higher education. What exactly is the major trend that you are inquiring about?
Job opportunities.
Job opportunities again. So I would say that in India it feels like it's a burgeoning area for opportunity. Like you have the chance of working with a think tank like I do. You have the chance of becoming an actual government consultant. Nowadays a lot of ministries, especially like in the central government, do put out call for applications for people who have like some backing in law and policy and things like that, and you can directly work with them, work with the ministry. You can become an academic who works in the space on like areas of preference, or yeah, or you can look outside as well. Like now also within the private sector there are a lot of companies which are now talking about dedicated policy teams and policy departments to sort of, so it's become like an like a second. So you have the legal department which deals with your litigation and legal queries, and then you have your policy team which is more about, like I said, negotiating policy with the government. So if it's an Uber, they will be talking with the Ministry of Road and Transport and getting sorted out like on like how can they make their apps more secure, what kind of road regulations that they need to follow, things like that. Those are again important policy avenues. And again, I think working with a private corporation is obviously going to pay you better. But yeah, those are like those things. And I would say that there's a great versatility to this area right now, both because it is evolving and the number of uh, newer fields and avenues that are opening up, or like people who are becoming more and more amenable to bringing on board policy researchers, is expanding. And the second thing is that no, actually that's just about it.
Yeah, so with this tone, due to paucity of time and other considerations, I thank you all participants. And sincerely, I first mentioned in the introduction, this is a very special session for all of us. So I thank you very much, sir, to spare out the minutes to talk with us. And take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, sir. Bye.